Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and we are going through a series called The Days of the Bones. This is based on the story of the Levite and the concubine in Judges 19. Now, you might think this is a rather random choice for a study, and it would be hard to imagine that there would be so much information about a story that's only a few pages in the Bible. But this is a perfect example of a story being told that we don't really understand because we don't know the context of the time. And it's an example of how we insert our own opinions and assumptions into a story where we don't really have the context there. So I've spent 2 weeks now just trying to explain kind of who the players are and what the region looks like. And the most significant thing about all this is the tabernacle that was in Shiloh. But to understand that the religious system, if you will, is still functioning. So that even though they crossed over the Jordan and Joshua died, he had basically divided up the land for the various tribes based on their size, based on the word of God, and based on the casting of lots. The religious system was still in place and it was important. And so the context for the story in Judges 19, of the Levite with his concubine has to do with the religious system. And as we go through the story, it will make sense, and then we can make an application perhaps for today. But we don't want to start making an application without understanding the historical context. And so I have emphasized over and over the significance of the tabernacle, which was in Shiloh, and where everything's functioning the way God had designed it to function. We have a high priest, Eli. We have the Levites servicing the folks and acting as the priests acting as mediators between the people and God. We have the place for the presence of God. All these things are factored in. We have the children of Israel going up to that central sanctuary, worshiping in the way that they had in the wilderness for their feast days, for their offerings, etc. So I know as we read the book, we don't even think about that because maybe it'll just mention Shiloh, but we don't associate it with actually anything happening. And one of my goals is for people to recognize that the place of the presence of God, the place where he put his name, and it is said that he actually put his name in the hills surrounding Shiloh, is important to, and so the Levite is functioning in that context. Now, last time I spoke rather quickly about a story leading up to Judges 19 about a guy named Micah who was from the region of Ephraim, and he had a shrine in this area, and in it tells us he had the ephod and the teraphim, which were the same word we use for the household gods that Rachel had, remember, when she was sitting on her camel in the tent and didn't move. But he was very desirous to have a Levite serve in his house. He's trying to create his own shrine for the place of God in his own house. And he's kind of buying off this Levite, and he's offering him wages and clothes and food to serve as a Levitical priest, if you will, in his house. Well, he opens himself up by doing that. And these scouts come along from the tribe of Dan, and they're checking things out to see whether they can take over that area. And Micah, I guess, unsuspecting, allowed them in their house, and so they were able to survey and do reconnaissance and figure out, hey, this is a great place to attack, which they eventually did. And the Levite, who had no allegiance whatsoever, it appears to Micah, ends up joining Dan and becomes a priest of Dan. And then Laish, the town in which Micah was in, was eventually rebuilt and renamed Dan. Why is Dan significant? Because this is the area that we have Jeroboam at Bethel setting up his own religious institution with his own temple, his own, completely opposite from Jerusalem, his own system of offering, his own system for festivals, etc. Now this is much later, because we're going on past the time of King Shaul to David to Solomon, and finally on to King Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and now we have these two. But it all goes back to this point, so that's why it's important. Again, we just have a picture here of Micah installing his priest with the household gods of teraphim and the ephod. So if we get to the story, finally, we look at the Levite from the hill country in Ephraim, and so because of all that, he held a place of honor in Israelite society. So it was a very honorable thing to serve as a Levite. And this, as we move into Judges 19, this story is connecting to the previous two chapters, 17 and 18. Now, it tells us that the Levite took a wife, although the Hebrew word that's used there is the pilagesh, which is a concubine. At that particular period of time, her position in society is kind of ambiguous. We don't really know for sure exactly, what sort of honor or shame position that was in Israel society, but we do know she was from Bethlehem. Okay, so if you recall the map that I showed last time, we have Judah in the south, Benjamin in the middle, and Ephraim above in the north. So these three are kind of working together. Jerusalem's in the middle there in the area of Benjamin, and Ephraim's a little bit north, and that's where Shiloh is, and then we have Bethlehem down in the area of Judah. Now they're really close together. There's only a few miles apart there. But that's where she's from. And her father is living in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is fairly significant, a little town of Bethlehem. This is where Ruth settled after they came back from Moab with Naomi. She settled there. And of course, she married Boaz, and eventually out of her comes King David, the line of the kings. King David being born there, Yeshua also being born there, born in the same place where this concubine is from. It tells us she basically abandoned her husband and acts the harlot. It appears that she was betrothed to the Levite, and in ancient Israel there were two stages of marriage. There was the betrothal, and there was the full stage of marriage. Now, in ancient Israel, you could also secure divorce, or a get, they called it, in between those two stages. So you could be betrothed, which is as though you were married, but you could get a certificate of divorce or a bill of divorcement in that period before the second stage of marriage. So it's unclear. I maintain that they are in the betrothal stage, and it is in that stage that she's tells us that she's essentially playing a harlot. And so she's not going with the Levite back to his ancestral home at Shiloh, where he probably serves in the tabernacle there. She is determined to go back to her father's house. Now again, her father's house is in Bethlehem. So if we look ahead, there's something going on. I'm just going to kind of plant the seed now that we have these two houses. We have the house of Ephraim, where the Levite was from, and we have the house of Bethlehem, or the house of Judah, where the concubine was from. So they were supposed to unite in marriage. So there's a picture here of the bringing together of the tribes. Now you'll recall that in time, the northern tribes were separated from the southern tribes. The 10 northern tribes were under the dominion of Samaria. That was their capital. And they eventually were taken by King Sennacherib in that period by the Assyrians and hauled off and sent into all parts of the Assyrian Empire. And then we have the tribe of Judah, which eventually became Judah and Benjamin. And so the split was between the 10 and the 2. And we refer to them as the house of Israel, the house of Ephraim or Samaria, versus the house of Judah, you could say even Bethlehem, something along those lines. So this is setting the stage for something that is going to happen later, which ends up being fairly problematic in Israel. So let's just read this out of Psalm 108. It says, God has spoken in his sanctuary, because that is his oracle, and that's where he speaks. I will triumph. I will parcel out Shechem, and measure out the valley of Sukkot. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, also Ephraim. Ephraim is a helmet for my head, Judah is my scepter. Now that's kind of what we call Hebrew parallelism. I don't know if you're familiar with that as a literary device in Hebrew poetry in particular, but it will repeat the same thought and only described in a different way. So we could say the tents of Jacob, the house of Jacob, something along those lines. It's basically saying the same thing. So if Ephraim is a helmet for my head, what is that saying? It's talking about a crown. So there's something with kingship, rulership here. And if Judah is my scepter, it's that staff of authority and kingship. It's basically saying the same thing, because those were the centers of the two places that ended up splitting or dividing. And so everything became about the ingathering or the regathering of the tribes as they were dividing. So we see almost a prophecy coming forward here in the book of Judges, and specifically Judges 19, about what's going to happen in terms of the division between the tribes. So we're all familiar with the expression, a house divided against itself will not stand. The problem is we don't actually think about what that means and what house is being referred to. And so the house that's being referred to is the house of God, and it's talking about the temple. And so Yeshua referred to the same thing. So we're already seeing this division is going to be happening between the north and the south. We'll have the temple in Jerusalem. We see the altar there. And then we have an altar at Dan, Bethel, under Jeroboam. Again, that'll be much later. But it's the same thing. This house divided is not going to stand. It's talking about the house of God. It's talking about the temple and the place where he dwells. Now, I want to develop this a little further, this idea of this separation of vision that has to do with the harlot, the pilagesh, the concubine, because that expression is symbolic of a house. So in the Bible, when you're referring to a house, it always has a feminine component to it, because the woman in ancient Israel was seen as the one who was literally the house. And the house, her house would be built when she gave birth to sons. So when a son came forth, the house was being built, but she was considered the house. And you'll see that now, this will make more sense. So consider the house of Judah and the house of Israel as being feminine, essentially. So when we go, this is from Ezekiel 23, and this is dealing with Samaria and Jerusalem. Now look at the language that's used to talk about them. There were two women. So take us back to the concubine from Bethlehem. Daughters of the same mother, that's key. And how does it describe them? They were whores in Egypt. And their names were Oholah, the older one, and the younger was Oholivah, her sister. This is how a house was built up. They belonged to me, and they gave birth to sons and daughters. And that's how they would extend their reign, and as seed would come forth in building the house. Now here's where the Bible tells us that Shomron, or Samaria, is Oholah, and Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, is Oholivah. So Samaria will be the region of Ephraim, and Jerusalem, of course, is in the area of Judah, and so that's where the division is. Ezekiel 23 is a very graphic chapter. It might be not X-rated, but it's at least rated R. So it is in vivid detail, talking about these two daughters who were prostitutes of one mother, one house. So Oholah means her tent. So you see, this is talking about the house of God. And Oholivah means my tent in her. So Oholah is talking about Samaria, and Ephraim, also called the northern tribe of Israel. And Oholivah is talking about Judah. Now remember, Judah and Benjamin end up merging and becoming one, and it's dealing with Jerusalem. And in the future, we have the Assyrians taking Samaria, and we have the Babylonians taking Jerusalem. So, of course, we have to put this in its context because Ezekiel, if you'll remember, went into exile to Babylon with the children of Israel. So he's looking back and remembering in 721 BCE how the Assyrians came and the fall of approximately 721, the fall of Samaria. So this is past that particular time, but all of this is this description of this division between the two. So now we have these two houses that are in exile, following after their lovers, if you will. And again, the description is quite graphic. And that is the nations. So Israel is either in the land, worshiping her God, with the temple standing, honoring him, or as she disobeys him, she ends up being punished, exiled out of the land, because her desire appears to be for other nations. So her appetite is for the kings of other nations. And so in that, her house has been defiled, and she's lusted after these other ones like Babylon and Assyria. So in this chapter, we have these very colorful explanations of the defiling of the house. And the Chaldeans, for example, the glorious ones arrayed in these uniforms, and these alliances that she has made with the nations who oppress them. And so it was that God raised up their lovers, if you will, against them. So quite interesting in that regard. This is really important to understand because the Bible is often speaking about these other nations in relationship to God's chosen nation, Israel, and how she goes off after them. And so when we read it, it's confusing. We don't understand the language of allegory and metaphor, but God is always dealing with this problem. And so all of these empires that come to bear against Israel, that rule over them and set up their kings where the throne of God is supposed to be. So what's the one thing these kings go after? And we talked about Nebuchadnezzar. Assyria took the northern tribe and the seat and the throne of the northern tribe and tried to go after Judah. And this is around 700 BCE. Hezekiah is ruling and reigning at that time, and he was able to push them back. But that was the reason they wanted to conquer Jerusalem. They wanted to take the temple, they wanted to take the place of the presence of God and put their own king in God's place. It's not really any different when we get to the Second Temple period, because now who's the oppressor? It's Rome. And so the Caesar now is controlling the land of Israel. It's like they've sold themselves out once again to another king. And in the midst of all that is when Yeshua, our king, comes. And what a distinction between Yeshua as king and Caesar. There couldn't be any greater chasm than between the two. So the story is just repeated over and over and over again. Even the story that we have of the Samaritan woman at the well, this is in John chapter 4. So you remember Yeshua comes, he's at the well, and there's the Samaritan woman, and she's amazed because he tells her everything she ever did. But what is she saying to him? He reminds her that she's already had 5 husbands, and the one she's with now isn't her husband. But there's something being intimated here. Again, it takes us back to the concept of these empires. Now, we could debate over which 5 empires we're talking about. That could refer to Egypt, Assyria, Babylonian, the Medo-Persian Empire, Greece, and of course the one she's with now is not her husband, is Rome. So even though there's a personal application here to her, it's still dealing with this idea that Israel always wants to join herself in an unholy alliance with these empires. And folks, we aren't any different. I'm not singling out Israel here for any reason other than this is the language of the Bible that God is trying to communicate. There's only one God, and He's the one we are supposed to worship, and we were not supposed to join ourselves in an unholy alliance with political entities like these empires that rise and fall. We're not supposed to join ourselves at the hip with these kings and worship them instead of the one true God. So we have to be very careful about that. Who is our king and how do we serve him? And so this woman at the well, she got it. And so she immediately began to tell everyone because Yeshua was explaining these things to her. This was very much in the DNA of the people of Samaria. They knew full well about the Assyrians coming and hauling off the folks that were of the northern tribe and spreading them out through, scattering them to the various empires that would come later. So they understood that. Now let's just look for a few minutes at King Jeroboam. We're jumping ahead. This will be in 1 Kings 12, 25 through 31. It says, Jeroboam built up Shechem, same area in the hills of Ephraim, exactly the place we're talking about. The king made 2 calves of gold. Does that sound a little familiar, like what the children of Israel did out in the wilderness? And this has to do with language of what of these empires and how they worshipped and what they did. And he said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. So he is making a separation now. Now, of course, we're further along. We're past King Solomon here. Here are your gods of Israel who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he placed one of the calves in Bethel, we mentioned that, in Dan, and the other one in Dan. And he set up temples on the high places and made Kohanim, or priests, from among all the people, not descended from Levi. So everything he's doing is challenging the God of Israel. So he's setting up his own throne with his own people. He's created his own priesthood. Big problem. He's doing everything in opposition to Jerusalem. He is trying to get the folks to stop going up to Jerusalem and worship in the temple. He said it was so bad, he set up some kind of lumber of some kind for miles and miles and miles to prevent the people from even walking down the road to go to Jerusalem to worship the one true God. So he's bringing that worship on himself. Again, he made these 2 golden calves, and one in at Bethel and one actually in Dan. Those of you who've been to Israel up north at Tel Dan, you can see traces of that altar and that setting up that throne there. I mentioned earlier about Bethel, also called Luz. This was an area eventually captured by Joseph. This is in Bethel also. Deborah held court there in Ephraim. The Ark of the Covenant at one point sat there. The Israelites would go up to Bethel and inquire of God, the oracle of God. This was part of Samuel's circuit. So as he was the itinerant traveling around, he would stop in Bethel. So you can see what Jeroboam did to this particular place. So the ancients actually saw Bethel as the temple on Mount Moriah. So eventually Jeroboam expands the shrine in Bethel, and he rebuilds Shechem as the capital of Samaria, and the whole thing was to be in competition with Jerusalem and to replace the God of Israel with himself. And he did everything he could to prevent the worshipers that were in his areas, tribal area, from actually being able to go up to Jerusalem to worship. So now we got these 2 completely separate centers of worship vying and competing with one another. So all of this, again, takes us all the way back to the book of Judges. All this is going on even there. It tells us that Jeroboam instituted a festival in the 8th month. On the 15th day of the month, similar to the festival held in Judah. Now, what festival might that have been? We know that in the 7th month, on the 15th day, was the festival or Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so he's replacing all the feasts. And so this particular feast we see being replaced a month later in the 8th month instead of being celebrated in the 7th month as God had ordained. And it says he went up to the altar in Bethel to sacrifice to these calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the Kohanim, or the priests, that he appointed for the high place. Well, that wasn't his job to appoint those priests. Those priests, the high priests in particular, are supposed to be from the line of Aaron, and the priests were of the Levites. And so that he's got his own people in there, and he's just turning the whole thing upside down. And so certainly God is going to judge that. Again, everything comes back to the organization of the religious institution, and that is the context and backdrop for virtually all of the stories that we have. And so Dan and Bethel in the region of the northern tribes becomes important for them. Now, I'm just going to close out this particular session. If you go back and reread about the Levites and the 3 different families that served as the Levites, the Kohats, the Gershon, and Merari. They were from Amram, Merari. Just to mention, so you understand that all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. And then again, the Levites stood in place of the firstborn sons. They served as mediators in the sacred space, and so they represented the firstborn. Generally, they were not counted in the census, and they were set apart for service in the house of God. Again, when we go back to Judges 19, it is the Levite who is the one that's representing the house of God, and in that case, it's going to be Ephraim at Shiloh. Their responsibility was to tend and service and take care of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. We know that when the tabernacle moved in the wilderness, they were the ones that carried the various items from place to place. They would wrap them up in a certain way, and then they would be the ones to carry it. And they carried all the equipment and the furniture and the vessels, and took down the whole thing, all the curtains and the loops and the beams and everything else. That was their responsibility. And so they served in it. Of course, when they got to the next place, they would be the ones to set it up. So it had obviously a very important responsibility in Israel in terms of servicing the place of the presence of God. So we'll just close out this particular portion again and reminding you the significance of the place of the presence of God, that God has an order and structure, the way everything is supposed to work, the way we are supposed to approach, a protocol for coming into his presence. He used the Levites and the priests in the context of the temple to mediate between the people, to help the people approach God in the way that that God wanted them to approach. And so every time the Israelites violated that and did it their own way, nothing but trouble would come upon them. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Shalom.